Good morning, family and friends. Let's speak to you this morning from the subject, the power of prayer. The power of prayer. Acts 12, 1 through 24. But constant prayer was offered to God to him by the church. Acts chapter 12 is set in a context of mounting persecution for the children of God. The early Christians were under attack. And this attack was so insurmountable until God's people seemed unable to deliver themselves from it. There seemed no hope, no progress in sight, but only persecution, only death in sight. And it seemed that all they can do now was to pray. Sometimes we as Christians feel the same way about the situations we face on a daily basis. It could be someone we love who has an incurable disease, and we find no hope in our physicians, no hope in medication or diagnosis, but all we can do is pray. Maybe it's insecurity about our jobs, situations, circumstances, not sure if we're going to be laid off, and all we can do is pray. Trying to turn around someone who is straying away from the Lord, or moral decline in our nation as we see in this very day and age. And all we can do is pray, for there seems to be no other hope in sight, but there is power in prayer. Does anything sound more incredulous or even ridiculous or silly when there is crisis in the world and you have a group of people, a group of Christians who are praying for God to help us or help them in the middle of that circumstance? When people are declaring, this didn't work, we should try this and we should try that, and someone cries out, why don't we pray? I wonder if the words 1 Peter 3 and 12 are commentary to the time recorded in Acts 12. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. I came this morning to tell you that God sees our trials. God sees our trials. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, 1 Peter 3:12, the A clause. Now, about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. And then Herod killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. So when he had arrested him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after Passover. Verses 1 through 4 in chapter 12 of Acts. Between AD 41-44, the fifth of the Herod spoken of in the New Testament was in power. This Herod is the grandson of Herod the Great, who killed the babies in Bethlehem when he had heard that the Messiah was born. And he's the nephew of Herod, who had beheaded John the Baptist. This is Herod Agrippa. He was more popular than any of the previous Herods. Herod Agrippa did everything in his power to retain the favor of the ruling Jewish party, because he sensed that it was politically expedient, politically in his favor, if he began persecuting the Christians that had already begun by beheading John the Baptist. This had so pleased the Jews that he had Peter arrested, and he planned to put him to death as soon as the religious feast of Passover was over. Herod was obviously very much afraid that Peter would escape as others had escaped in the past. No doubt he was aware that Peter and John had previously escaped. Actually, they had been released by the angels. You remember it was recorded in Acts chapter 5. Herod was determined that this was not going to happen again. Verse 4 tells us that Peter was guarded by 4 quarter rooms, 4 soldiers in 4 different squads. Roman soldiers stood guard in 3-hour shifts, so there were always 4 soldiers guarding Peter, 2 chained to him and 2 standing guard outside the cell. It must have been quite a shock that James had not been delivered as Peter and John had been. Imagine how stunned and shattered they must have felt when the sad news that James had actually been executed by beheading. He had not been delivered as Peter and John had. James was the first of the apostles to lay down his life as a martyr. When Peter was in prison, the church assumed nothing. They immediately began making earnest prayer for him. This is what we have to understand here about the power of prayer. God sees us in our circumstance. God sees us in our trials. The first thing we should do, as evidenced here by the saints of old, is not start plotting, planning, or scheming, or conniving, but go into earnest prayer. And when we go into earnest prayer, God will not only show up and show out, God will reveal to us that which he would have us to do. But we notice here that James was not delivered. God has a plan for each of us. We need to stop planning out the answer to our prayer. But I declare today that there is power in our prayer. There is power in our prayer because God sees and is in the midst of our trials. May God bless and keep you is our prayer today. And as always, should you have any questions, please feel free to inbox me. God bless.